Good afternoon, everybody. It wasn't just flak or German fighters that the Royal Air Force and the Royal Canadian Air Force were fighting in the Second World War. There was another implacable enemy, the weather. I had wanted a different title to my book, Black Night for Bomber Command, whose subject was the events of Black Thursday, 16th of December 1943. I would have preferred it to be called Fighting the Weather. The phrase was one of Winston Churchill's. I am not pressing you to fight the weather as well as the Germans. Never forget that. That was how he'd instructed Bomber Command's Commander-in-Chief, Arthur Harris. In the event, it proved just fine words. The reality was that the air war could not be conducted on nights of fine weather where visibility was clear. For a start, operations to cities like Berlin needed long, dark winter nights rather than the warm and short ones of summer. At dusk on Thursday, 16th of December 1943, nearly 500 aircraft, almost entirely Lancaster bombers, set off for Berlin. The journey was a long one, more than 7 hours, and meant penetrating deep into enemy territory. The crews flew from dozens of airfields in East England, from North Yorkshire to southern Cambridgeshire, soon after 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Bombs began to fall on the German capital some 4 hours later, and the Lancasters were expected back around midnight. In the event, more than 300 airmen died that night, almost half of them when the raid should have been over, victims of the weather. The weather had been grim for days, fog and frost. In York, not far from here, it was 26 degrees Fahrenheit on the 15th, 6 degrees of frost. We have actually got used to 18 degrees this last winter, but there you go. By the 16th, there was great pressure to get crews airborne and thundering east to resume the attack on the German capital. That particular Thursday was cold, sunless and misty, much as it had been for weeks. The temperature was around freezing. There had been no operations since the 2nd of December, 2 weeks before. The weather forecast was for cloud to increase as the night wore on, and there was little attempt to disguise the fact that the fog would be widespread. The Met officer at Whiting in Cambridgeshire painted a gloomy picture of fog obscuring the country, and with no diversion airfields available by the time of our return, the general attitude was one of, if we're going, let's get on with it. We might even get back before the fog really clamps down. Many aircrew that night were expecting the operation to be cancelled, but of course it wasn't. Many were also aware of where they might be heading in the darkness and the mist. I knew, one of them said, when they put in 1850 gallons of fuel in the tanks. I thought, it'll be Berlin. The weather data for Linton that night, which I have here, in my pocket I think, has a column in it headed Weather Fitness. Essentially it's a numerical judgment of how suitable the weather was for flying. The score for Linton at 5 o'clock that day was 5 out of 9. By midnight it was 4 out of 9. I found in the National Meteorological Archive a note which indicated that 0 out of 9 meant landing would be impossible. So it would seem the conditions were on the borderline for flying that night when they set off. 10/10 cloud all evening, and, most significantly, a gradually lowering cloud base. By the time the aircraft were returning, bombs dropped, the fog was thick. The cloud base was now desperately low, on occasions less than 300 feet. A significant number of pilots encountered major problems in locating their home airfield, or indeed any aerodrome at all. There is no doubt that the conditions at some, Linton being one of them, was appalling, with visibility effectively nil, and with conditionings worsening by the hour. At one, born in Cambridgeshire, from where my father-in-law flew, for example, the fitness for flying quotient was judged as 0 by midnight. Overall, the difficulties of that night were such that many pilots, some 70 in all, diverted to alternative airfields. Imagine that confusion and uncertainty in the skies. The first aircraft were due back soon after 11. The round trip typically took about 7.5 hours, and from Yorkshire through to Cambridgeshire, ground crew and WAFs were anxiously waiting for the sound of returning aircraft. As well as the thick fog, pilots were deeply concerned about fuel beginning to run out. Another cause for concern was the topography of the country. Here in Yorkshire, the high moors, and particularly the scarp on which we sit here, running north-south to the east of the Vale of York, were a trap for the unwary. Desperate pilots seeking to slip in below the cloud, a major problem when the cloud was at ground level. In the event, 43 aircraft crashed that night, the victims of the weather, not the Germans. During research for my book, I began a long-range and long-sustained email conversation with 426 Squadron's flight sergeant, as he was on Black Thursday, Roger Coulon. Forgive me if I've got the pronunciation wrong. He wrote to me on one occasion, "We eventually made it back to England from Berlin to find our base airport closed in because of very thick fog. So thick, it gave the impression that we were floating in milk. The visibility was zero. The atmospheric pressure had changed so much in 7 hours that our altimeters, functioning on atmospheric pressure, gave false height readings." At some point in my book, I think I calculated the typical extent to which the altimeters were out, and quite often they were as much as 500 or 600 feet. The Yorkshire crashes that night were usually on high ground, and unlike other areas of the country, no aircraft crashed as they began their final approach. Most came down some distance from base, either redirected to another aerodrome in the hope that the weather was better there, or presumably floundering and lost in the ubiquitous milky fog. Roger Coulon memorably described to me at one point how he saw, and I'm quoting exactly from his email, the black tower water tank of the station appearing right off my left wingtip. And if you've been to Linton and looked at that water tower, you realise how low that was. Why did it happen, despite Churchill's seemingly soothing words about bad weather flying? Well, there was undeniably an implacable determination to take the war to Germany, irrespective of the weather. Press on regardless attitude. Interestingly, the commanding officer of 97 Squadron, my father-in-law's squadron, which lost 7 aircraft that night, until the day before Black Thursday, was a Group Captain Fresson, known to all as Press On, Fresson. Crews who returned early, operations not completed, were carpeted, beset with questions and doubts. Other factors concern the quality of training, the accuracy of altimeters and the adequacy of fuel allocations. What could be worse than being an inexperienced pilot that night, with the fuel nearly gone, a navigator struggling to locate your position, and the hills of Lincolnshire or Yorkshire somewhere out there in the darkness? 426 Squadron had 13 aircraft on the raid that night. 7 completed the raid and got back okay, between 23-31 hours. Incidentally, that was the very moment when Squadron leader Neil's aircraft crashed here at Yearsley, and 3 minutes after midnight, the last aircraft landed. 2 were forced to return early with mechanical problems. 2 crews were forced to bail out, and 2 crashed. One at Huntingdon, not far from RAF Marston Moor, and the other at Yearsley, the reason we are here today, nearly 68 years later. To conclude, I thought the following short poem was appropriate. 426 Squadron, after all, was known as Thunderbirds. And interestingly, I think the poet, Michael Skeet, his father was at RAF Havana in Iraq during the war at the same time as my own father. Wings of Thunder. They rode the wind on wings of thunder when our nation's peace was torn asunder. In that time of need they answered the call to give of their youth and many their all. Riding the wind over land and sea, setting aside thoughts of what might be. Borne aloft on their thundering wings, parted from home and their cherished things. Braving the night fighters' shells and flak, yet knowing that many might never come back. Trusting to fate in that fearsome hell, stricken from flight, many tumbled and fell. The lucky ones, saved by their silken threads, sent to ponder their war from prison camp beds. They carried their missions time and again, facing the fears and taking the strain. In thousands they thundered the sky in flight. The extent of their loss brings tears to the sight. In Bomber Command, those men bold and brave were the nation's cause to serve and to save. Forging a freedom for all to live under, they rode the wind on wings of thunder.
We're grateful to have the Kirkby Moorside Band with us this afternoon. And as they play for us now, it's a good opportunity to go over in our minds the words and the messages that we've heard so far in this service.